Amazing. So, thank you everyone for joining the session this evening. It's great that you've managed to carve out some time to join us and the amazing panel that we've got this evening to talk to you. This is a series of masterclasses that we've got happening, and this one in particular is called Celebrating Your Impact. So it's all about evaluating and monitoring your impact. And these sessions are designed to really support our members who make a livelihood from permaculture and want to find ways that they can improve their practice and really learn and develop through that. So we're hoping that we'll hit the mark with that, and you'll find this session this evening really, really useful. It's designed for a whole range of different professionals, so project leaders, teachers, designers, businesses, consultants. So hopefully there's something for everyone. Just to run you through the format of the session this evening, it's going to be run as a panel with a series of key questions that Andy's going to put to the people who've joined us with our experts. So yeah, just to say, if you have any questions, that's amazing. But if we could ask you to pop them in the chat, because I can then manage those. We've got a lot to get through this evening, and we've only got an hour and a half. So hopefully we can get to those at the end. Yeah, please feel free to put them in, and we'll see how far we get. So yeah, to introduce our panelists this evening. So we've got Anne-Marie Mayer, who has done loads of amazing work in developing training materials and resources for permaculture projects to assess the impact of their work. She's worked mainly in the Global South on programmes and policies related to agriculture and nutrition, and she's been supporting those projects and assessing their impact. She's worked also in person with Permaculture Projects in Nepal and Kenya on their monitoring and evaluation. And she's the co-founder of the Permaculture Impact project, which seeks to support permaculture projects in developing in those areas. And then we've got James Atherton, who works with several philanthropy, I can never say that word, I've been practicing all day and still managed to not quite get it, and prize programs. He has been exploring how to flow resources in the most equitable and trust-based ways. So basically really focusing on that fair share ethic of permaculture in aid of regeneration. So James will be exploring the types of questions that you might ask yourself and your community when you're applying for one of those unique funding models. James is a queer vegan permaculture designer and a budding teacher as well, so it's great to have him on the panel this evening. And then we've got Samuel, last but not least, co-founder of Soul Haven, which is a sustainable permaculture farm and an educational rejuvenation centre. He's been formally recognised for his outstanding contribution to his community's well-being, and he's received national and international awards for this, as well as speaking engagements through the Lush Spring Prize, Permaculture Magazine Award and the Weetabix Sustainability Award. Soul Haven have also been featured by ITV and BBC Northampton Radio, and I guess importantly for this session have been awarded significant amounts of money for the work that they do via bids for funding, which obviously monitoring and evaluation is really important for. So we're going to hear from this host of experts this evening about how they've been at the forefront of delivering those permaculture and regenerative messages, and how, most importantly, how they've been measuring the impact of those. So yeah, I'll pass over to Andy, who will introduce himself, and then we'll dive straight into the questions.
Great. Thank you, Hannah. Thank you very much. Thanks for all the introductions, and thanks for all the work behind the scenes that make these events work. Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Andy Goldring. I'm Chief Executive of the Permaculture Association, and I'm not going to give you a biography. I don't think it's needed. I'm I'm here to host it, but I'm here also to learn, because I think measuring our impact in terms of permaculture in particular is a very, very difficult thing to do. You know, I remember, you know, if you want to know my biography, I started as a reformed art student. I had no idea what impact was, what the difference was between impact and outcomes and outputs. You know, there's lots of different language involved, and it took me quite some time to get to grips with it and to really to understand it really and see the value. I mean, I've always been someone who just jumps in and makes stuff happen. And it's taken me a while to realize that sometimes we need to step back and observe more and think about, well, what bit about what we did actually worked? Did it work? Did I get the results I wanted? Am I spending my time wisely? So yeah, I mean, I've been involved in lots of different projects, and the more based in the community and at the local level and in sort of immediate term they are, the easier it is to understand what you're doing. But as an organization with a national and even international reach that supports other people to do things, it's very hard. So I'm just hoping that by the end of this session, I'm going to have learned something new, and I'm sure I will have done. So, okay, why don't we start off with a kind of broad question, and we'll give it to James, Anne-Marie, and Samuel. And just that broad starting point of, can you tell us a bit about the perspective that you're bringing when it comes to evaluating our impact? And maybe I might even just say, could you say what you mean by impact?
Wow, thanks, Andy. Yeah, and thanks for passing to me first. Oh my gosh, how do I answer that? I was hoping that the others would give me some ideas first. No, I'm just kidding. But it's such a pleasure to be here. And yeah, like you said, Andy, I'm really excited to learn as well from this amazing panel, Anne-Marie and Samuel as well, and everyone here. My perspective is I'm coming from a variety of organizations which are focused on funding the regenerative movement. So I work with the Lush Spring Prize, which is a prize program funded by the cosmetic company Lush. But as a prize program, impact is something that we have been really interested in, because prizes by nature aren't like grants. So we usually apply for grants for specific projects, right? But prizes tend to be a little bit more celebratory in nature. And usually funders ask for quite specific things when it comes to grants, but for prizes, it tends to be a little bit more open. And at Spring Prize, we've tried to think of what we ask for when it comes to the recipients of prizes to make it a little bit more useful. Because when we ask people what they mean by impact, or rather why they're doing a monitoring or evaluation process, often it comes back to this thing of, well, we're doing it because our funders asked us to, right? We're doing it because we've been asked by someone else to do it. But of course, there are many other fantastic reasons for measuring our impact. We've said some already tonight. For example, building the movement of permaculture, building, the evidence base of permaculture, showing what we've been doing works. But this is kind of one perspective of Spring Prize. And I'll just mention one other organization I work with, Regenerosity, which is also thinking about how can we flow resources to regenerative and permaculture projects, but also in ways that are regenerative, kind of acknowledging that funding models in the past have been quite maybe even colonial by nature, in terms of it's hoarded wealth. Usually it's wealth in the hands of a few that's being trickled out to some others. So how do we get that money flowing where it can be making the most impact? And of course, what do we mean when we say impact?
Recording in progress.
Sorry. Oh, cool echo. Of course, impact can, no worries, can mean so many things to different permaculture practitioners. And I think one thing that is unique across permaculture practitioners in terms of impact is how it's embedded in the place where they are and relevant to the people and the place in making change. But I'm sure we'll come more into this. I'm speaking a lot already. I'm passing on to Anne-Marie.
Yep, thanks, James. And
Great. Great. Well, first of all, very nice to be here tonight. I'm thinking the perspective I bring is quite mixed, really. I had an early start with permaculture, which I studied, back in 1992, and then I've had a career working in international development, and through that, I've done a lot of work with different NGOs and international organisations, and doing special research projects and evaluations, etc. And having done that, I was thinking, well, what's going on in permaculture? And I went to several conferences and conversions, and seeing that people were talking about marvelous things they were doing, but there weren't many sort of impact evaluations. And I thought, well, perhaps permaculture is missing a trick here, because from the experience I'd had of working more on the mainstream, a lot of mainstream projects are doing quite, relatively limited interventions, on just a few levels, whereas permaculture can do so much, big integrated projects. And it would be great to be telling their story. So that's how, the last few years, I've got interested in looking at permaculture projects and supporting them to be able to measure their impact. So if we're talking about impact, I think it depends. We think about it as a lasting change. So, when your project's finished and gone away, something is still there. That might be the impact. And it relates as well to the objectives of your project. So I know people get confused about what's the difference between outcomes and impact, and it slightly depends on what you're trying to do. If you've achieved your objectives, then that's your impact, really. So you can describe it in different ways, but I think it's helpful to think of something that lasts after you've finished doing your activities. Okay.
that's great.
Samuel.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. Samuel.
Hi. So Soul Haven is a community project, and it was based out of our own experience of wanted to give back. So both my partner and I have both experienced homelessness, and we wanted to create a safe place to be. And our journey did start with a fund ago. During lockdown, we were looking at how we could do things differently because we were struggling. Very much it was self-funded until that point. And I approached the National Lottery and said, well, I've got this great idea. I'd like to do this project, which is the project that we're currently running called Plan the Mind. And I want to do a 5-year project. I want 500k. Thank you very much. And they turned around and went, we like the idea. That's a bit bigger than what we can fund. So what can you do we'd like to see a project for 1 year. And one of the main questions they asked was, how are you going to evaluate this project? So that's where we started, they're saying that we have to do it. And then we started that whole process of, we had to show people, get people's interest. So we started talking to different people going, well, what do you do? I'm talking to councils and different organizations, how they use different tools and what they used. And then we've gone a full kind of circle of using these things for different purposes of why we use these. So our focus is helping people. And we use evaluation as a means to show the funders how well we're doing. The most important thing is we're using it for the people attending our project to see the change in their lives, because it's so easy when you're, as humans, that we forget where we've come from. And if we put in a good place where people are seeing that change physically, they can look back and go, I was here at the start of a project. So in our program, we do it at the beginning of a project. I'll cover it later in one of the later questions, and in the middle and at the end. And then the people can see how they have changed. And that is the greatest impact, to see somebody's life and see the realization of what has happened. And that gives you that information for funders, sponsors, for other people to look at your project and go, yeah, that is working.
Brilliant. Thanks, Samuel. I love that. I think that's really important, isn't it? But and not very, I don't think it's very widespread, but the ability to do the impact work so that it comes back into the project, not just goes out to the funder. I think that is, but not just to the project, to the staff, but also to the participants. I think that's a really vital kind of component you brought in there. Fantastic. So thank you all for kind of giving us the sort of broad view. Why don't we sort of dive in now and think about some of the sort of steps that we might take in moving towards understanding our impact. So, you know, what might be some of the steps? And I think with this, I don't think we necessarily have to go person to person to person, but we can go around. But it's okay to pass on some of these. I think I've got at least 12 questions ahead of me, and some of them overlap, so I don't feel like you have to answer everything all the time. But let's start with. Oh, I think the order's just changed in front of my eyes, but that's fine. Let's start with this one. Why do you think it's important to evaluate the impact of your work or project? We've said that to a certain extent, but maybe let's just have some. Start with that. What makes? Why is it important? And we'll go James, Anne-Marie, and Samuel, and we can go. As I say, you can pass if you want.
Great, thanks, Andy. Yeah, I mean, as Samuel was speaking, I was getting shivers already. We've only been here 15 minutes and I'm already getting goosebumps from what you're saying, Samuel, about being able to see the really apparent change of how a person was or how a piece of land was, and being able to see that evolution and that growth. And I think that really is a deeply motivating part of why we might want to measure our impact, to be able to motivate others to see, look, like how I've grown, how my land has transformed, how my community has transformed, my business, you know, whatever our permaculture design may be. Like being able to motivate others and show them, wow, look at this transformation that going through the permaculture design process can do. And I think ultimately that is probably it for a lot of us, is this desire to inspire others to become permaculture designers and regenerators and really build this movement and grow this movement and inspire others. And that's really what showing impact can do. I mean, there's a lot of studies actually that show being able to show someone a demonstration of permaculture and regenerative projects, showing people, taking someone to your land, taking someone to your community, your social space that's been designed by permaculture, and showing them the change and the impact. There are studies that show how much more effective that is than someone just, you know, reading about it or you know, seeing a few photos, being able to physically experience it. And I feel like many people just choose to do monitoring and evaluation because it is a necessity for some funders. But I really like this inquiry that you were saying, Andy, of, you know, what could it mean if it was more meaningful for us as permaculture practitioners too? You know, what would we need to measure to make it, you know, impactful and meaningful for our communities and our project to measure? And I think sometimes going back to, if you're doing it for a funder, going back to the funder and saying, well, actually, can we also measure this, or can we change this question? because I'll be able to talk to press more about that, or I'd be able to show people more impact through this question. So yeah, thanks.
Thanks, James. And Anne-Marie?
Yes, no, I agree. I agree wholeheartedly. It's about motivation of people working on a project, people participating in a project. Being able to see the success is very motivating. But in addition, we can't always assume that our projects are doing well. Winston Churchill, however beautiful the strategy, it's still worth looking at the results. I think that applies. We don't want to make assumptions that we're having an impact without really checking. And getting the evidence for talking to policymakers, getting the evidence so that people can feel confident standing in front of an audience and explaining what they've been doing. That's very useful. Then, of course, it's getting the funding. It does help to get funding if you can tell your story and tell it well and show what your impact has been. Your project will grow if you can do that.
Great, thank you. And Samuel?
So for us, as I said, it's about showing people's own, and it comes back to obtaining a yield. So the yield that you are delivering is not just what you grow, it's the impact on society. So when we always go back to those ethics, people care, and the future, the future fair share or future care. So by showing the impact that we have today, we can point an arrow to what is a better future. And it's not just for us, because it gives us inspiration, because it's only by knowing how you've improved that you can have that ability to, we've stood that up for we've actually made an improvement on people's lives. We've helped 86 people in our first year of our project, and then you can say, okay, I've helped 86 people. We've had X amount of people go through that project, and then it builds from them, because it's what funders look at. It's what the people who may prescribe. So for us, we're working with social prescribers, local hospitals, and it's just grown and grown and grown, because people are going, Solhaven, that's the place you want to go to. So we're getting referrals from different organisations, and then other people coming to us going, we want to do the same as you. So that's where these impacts show, because we've got demonstrable results. We've got a evaluation report, and that's how we went. 3 years ago, we were thinking of closing. We were at an end. We didn't know whether we would survive. This year, we've hit over £100,000 worth of turnover. That's transformation. In just a very short, a few years' time, our project has completely changed. From what we were unknown, and still people are still, I didn't know you were there, but it's that being able to measure that and show that that's so important.
Yeah. Thanks, Samuel. I mean, I'm glad you brought in the permaculture principle of obtain a yield. I think that's great. That's seeing the impact surveys and the impact data and the results as an important yield. Pardon me, sorry, I've got a bit of a thing going on. Yeah, and I think that's really important, isn't it? But we feel like there's a real value in it for us in doing it, so it's not just a job for someone else. So that I kind of obtain a yield. And that got me thinking. There's a number of other permaculture principles that I can think of that could apply here. So rather than me list them off, I'm going to see whether the three of you can kind of drop them into your conversation as we go. So yes, I've got a list. I'm going to tick them off when you said them. So little challenge there. So there's different sorts of kind of evaluation that we do, isn't there? So we're talking about impact evaluation, celebrating our impact. But then, you know, there's different kinds. So like, you know, at the end of an event, you might get sent a survey to say how was the venue and what was the content like, and you know, we're happy with the administration. That's probably not so much an impact evaluation. That's more like a more ordinary evaluation about maybe the value of a particular event or something. What do you think the difference is between kind of impact evaluation and any other sort of form of evaluation? Is there a distinction? Is there anything special about it? And maybe we could go around as you like. I don't want to put Samuel last every time. So who wants to come in on that first? I guess the distinction between impact evaluation and other forms of evaluation.
Well, was Samuel about to say something? We're all going to have a long silence, then all talk at the same time, aren't we? But for me, I think, yeah, I referred to what I thought impact was before, and I think it's going the extra mile and finding out what's the lasting change. And in evaluation terms, it's about, you know, what were you aiming to achieve, and have you achieved it? And I think a lot of evaluations that I've seen all over the place are the sort of easier versions, which is looking at your outputs, like how many training sessions you've had, how many people turned up, you know, that sort of thing. But those types of evaluations can fall out of your kind of management data. But to look at the impact, you usually have to go a bit further than that and do a bit deeper research and talk to people, etc. So they're more expensive usually, which is probably why they don't always happen.
So more in depth. Anything you'd like to add to that, Samuel?
Yeah, so we tend to do a combination of different types of evaluation to give us a broad of different ways of looking at things. In the impact evaluation, it is seeing that change. So for example, we use a thing called the outcome star, which is a method of looking at people's mental health, is the one that we use. So people can rate themselves from I'm not doing very well to I'm like in a hole. That, you know, it's got a graphic actually, which is really useful on the chart we give people. So it's got a picture of somebody literally in a hole, going I'm in a hole, or I'm up to the other end, which is 10. I'm independent. I'm on my own, and I'm going somewhere. So somebody can really relate to that, and this is a self-led evaluation. So somebody is looking at themselves and going, how well do I feel I'm doing in this situation? How well am I dealing with my emotions, or being, and that is enabling what we teach. We bring in the permaculture principles to everything we do. So it's allowing somebody to be able to observe themselves and then interact with the things that they see. You know, you're kind of learning to take a step back and go, well, that's interesting. I can see that I was here and now I'm here. The thing is that sometimes people don't like to look at themselves in these ways. So we have to be able to do that in a gentle way. We have that type of evaluation, and then we might have something where we now employ an occupational therapist as part of our program. And that is then somebody who's trained in observation, who can look at somebody and see the differences, and they'll make notes on that, and they'll make the notes of the changes that they see. So it's from the observation of people that they can do these similar evaluations, but it's not so much of You know, somebody might be in a bad place and they go, I don't want to do the evaluation today. And that's okay. But, you know, giving something else that may support it, like observation or a simple tick sheet of smiley face, not so smiley face. And it's all these different things that enable you to be able to do that kind of evaluation. I hope I'm not going off too far.
Thanks, Samuel. James, any thoughts on?
Yeah, nothing really to add aside from that, Samuel. I love this game of that you said, Andy, of get the principles, and Samuel, you got one, I think, observe and interact. It's, back to kind of what Anne-Marie was saying earlier about why impact evaluations don't really happen that much, and it's because they tend to be a bit more expensive. And I really agree with that, Anne-Marie, because I think when you're thinking of what is the vision that you're hoping to achieve in your permaculture design, whether it's more of a social, community, or land-based design, it tends to be, when you think of those impacts that you're hoping to achieve, they tend to be things that are quite long-term. And I think often when we have funding reports, or when funders ask us to report, it's usually after just a year or when that project is finished. And it also tends to be more output-based things that we're asked to report. So kind of like you were saying, Andy, this distinction between outputs and outcomes. You know, outputs being things that you have done. For example, I've trained 100 people, or 200 people have come to my permaculture farm. So those kind of outputs that are usually a bit more quantitative, a bit more numerical. And impact reporting tends to be a little bit more long-term, and you might not even see those changes after the first year of receiving funding. And I think that's one of the reasons why, like Anne-Marie was saying, it tends to be a little more expensive and a little bit more challenging even. And it also tends to be a bit more qualitative. So if we're thinking of, increases in biodiversity, how are ways that we're going to show that are easy to communicate with funders, and especially if in only 1 year. So I think if this comes up, I'd kind of encourage a conversation with funding partners to say, look, if you want to see impacts, let's talk in 2 years' time or 3 years' time, or beyond just the year. And I also think if we're thinking our goal is to create more interest and spread the permaculture movement and inspire people, those impacts are the things that we want to be seeing and measuring, rather than just the outputs, because it's important to measure what your projects are outputting. It's important to know that we've trained this many people, but what's really going to touch people and inspire people, I think, is those wider impacts, the change to land, the transformation of people, the more inner work and the outer work as well.
Yeah. Thanks, James. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's the difference between, picking up from what you've all said, the difference between how many people came on my training session through to 5 years later. What are they doing now? They did that training session. What jobs did they get? Have they applied it to their home and garden? Did they set up a farm? And that is really much more complex to really look at those deep outputs and the outcomes and impacts. And I think in lots of ways, it feels like 40-year Permaculture Association started in 1983. And I feel like 40 years later, we're really now quite well placed to look at what kind of impact permaculture has had in the UK. But actually, it's probably taken that long, because you can start, and we can see we're having a lot of impact, but we couldn't have measured it in 1984. There probably wasn't very much. It does take time, doesn't it, if we're really talking about lasting change. So Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very good time to be talking about this, actually, because the more of us that can really start engaging with this impact work, the more effective we're going to be. Okay, so let's hope that one of the impacts of this session is that more people go out and do an impact evaluation. Where would they start? Where would they start? So what are some of the main steps that you think are needed to get you started on designing a kind of impact evaluation project? So again, I'm going to who would like to come in on this first? Samuel?
Yeah, so one of the key things that we did in our organisation, guided by the National Lottery, was to look at a theory of change. And this is the kind of mapping out what we thought the impact would be, what the outputs of our project was. And from that then gives us a basis of what we're looking at. And then it was also talking to people about what they were doing. So it's not about doing everything from, oh, we've got to do it our way. It was finding out what does work. And from that, that's how we gained interest in our project, was through the theory of change. We went away, we did a theory of change, and then we sent that to loads of people going, this is the program that we want to do. And it clearly showed what we were going to do, how we were going to deliver it, and what that would give people in their lives. And, and it was short-term, mid-term, long-term results. And some of them are a bit intangible, so a bit harder to look at. And then from we actually talked to somebody from the local council, and there's like, we use the outcome star. And then we talked to somebody at the local hospital, and guess what they use? The same thing. So I thought, it might be a good idea to use the same tool as the people who will be referring to us, because then they know what they understand. You're speaking the same language. And that was really, I think, key to the transformation, to be able to have that theory of change, and then to have a tool that was common, and to be able to then show that to people and say, look, this is what we've done. Here's the diagrams, and they could see. It's like a life web. You can see the differences in people's lives. And we've gone on now to develop that further with our occupational therapist, looking at what other models that we can use.
Fantastic. Thanks, Samuel. Anne-Marie?
Shall I go on? Yeah, I was going to mention the theory of change. I agree with you entirely. I think the theory of change is really, really useful for linking, your objectives to your activities and all the intermediate steps. How do you expect your activities to end up with achieving this objective? And what will success look like when that's a useful question to ask. What will success look like? How will we know that we've achieved this thing? And also, I think with permaculture projects, particularly, they can be quite complex, and you don't have to measure everything. So it's a case of prioritizing and to identify a few key questions. Coming from nutrition, it's usually, has this project improved people's diets? Has this project improved people's health? Has this project improved people's nutritional status? We want to be clear about what we're looking for, and not doing that splendidly on your own, but in a participatory way. And I think, if you build up the theory of change with a participatory process, that will be helpful. That you've got a sort of buy-in already with the theory of change, so that some of the outcomes that you identify what success looks like. This is the sort of outcome. This is how we might go about measuring it or assessing it. Work out who knows about what you're doing, who's sensible people to ask whether things have changed. So it's kind of a logical progression, really. So what you're trying to achieve, what will it look like if you've achieved it? Who can you talk to about that? What questions make sense to ask? And then you start thinking, well, have we got the budget? Have we got the expertise? How are we going to really do it? But I think there's a logical thinking behind it.
Anne-Marie, you've said, you just to go a little bit further, it seems like a good opportunity maybe to ask you a bit about, I know you did the nutrition survey with the Himalayan Permaculture Centre. Could you say a bit more about that? Because that really got some great results. And is there anything in particular you kind of draw out from that around measuring?
Yeah, I think what was interesting there was because I was working with a lot of people who'd been involved with design and have been active in the project for some time. With the staff, we could work out these theories of change quite easily. They understood, and it was quite complex. There were 42 activities or something like that, and it was quite easy for them to draw it out into a theory of change. And the people involved in the communities were very happy to answer questions. It was quite straightforward from the theory of change to devise the questions. And then I did focus group discussions with women separately and men separately, and devised a whole string of questions. And it was a mixture of open-ended and set questions. And yeah, I think it worked quite well, really.
Yeah. And the results were good, weren't they?
Yeah, I mean, the results were good. There were plenty of things that were going really, really well. And there were one or two areas that they hadn't thought of. So, I came up with a list of recommendations and talked to them about several months later, and they'd put all the recommendations in place, which was fantastic.
Yeah. So that is back to the kind of observe and interact.
Observe and interact, yes.
Yeah.
Should have thought of that.
Very much.
Should have said that.
James, is there anything else, anything you can add to this, some of the main things you'd need to work out? Sorry, some of the main steps you'd need to take to get started on an impact evaluation?
Well, first of all, this thing about, I would absolutely trust the Himalayan Permaculture Centre to have amazing outcomes to show and impact, because they're amazing. But I feel like even if you're going through a process of measuring your impact, it's also good to highlight and make visible the things that didn't go well. I just wanted to add in there. And also don't be afraid to share it with funders, because in my experience, a lot of people value that honesty and that learning that comes from it. And it also, I guess, allows you to apply self-regulation and accept feedback.
Yeah.
There you go.
Ding.
Another one. Point. But I feel like going through that process of learning and integrating it into the learning, and like you said, Anne-Marie, that process allowed you to develop some recommendations as well. So it can be a really useful process for any project to also highlight the things that could change and could grow and could develop. But ways to start, I also really value the theory of change process and think it's a great process to go through. And I feel like if a community, if a group of people, if a project is going through this process and wanting to do an impact evaluation, I feel like there's some questions to reflect on to begin with. And Anne-Marie has mentioned some about what do you imagine what's your vision? What do you want the change to be? What are you hoping to see? And I think that's really key. And Anne-Marie, you also mentioned the budget, and I think that's very important as well, because a number of people suggest that up to 20% of your program's budget should go onto a good monitoring and evaluation process. 20%, it sounds like a lot, but acknowledging that these processes can be quite long, and also, of course, depending on how deep you want to go, it can be very useful. I think not a lot of funders would accept that in a budget necessarily, but of course, it's good to have conversations with funders and see how much they would, feel acceptable to allocate towards that. But for a good, thorough, scientific, you're giving it enough time, giving it enough headspace and enough money, like up to 20% is good to think about. Of course, depending on what your budget is.
Yeah.
And I feel like this thing of how deep do you want to go with the impact evaluation is important to think about at the beginning as well too, because if you want to be very thorough, then you have to start at the beginning as well. You have to do a baseline. You have to see how things are now before you do anything, right? So thinking about it at the beginning and thinking about how thorough you want to be is very important. And I think if the outcome, if the vision you're imagining is to, Anne-Marie, I think you mentioned this earlier, but influence policymakers, which I think, oh my gosh, wouldn't that be amazing if we could influence policymakers across the world to implement, permaculture design and permaculture solutions, then they will need to see quite a rigorous and scientific approach. And that means giving a lot of time and investment into this process, which means doing a baseline survey before you begin, which means having, if it's a land-based project, land that is the kind of neutral and doesn't have your permaculture design on it, so you can have that fair comparison. So I think thinking about how deep you want to go, how much investment you want to put into it is a key question to begin with as well. And that will help inform which tools you want to work with. And Samuel has mentioned the outcome star, right, Samuel? Yeah, which I think is a fantastic tool, especially for people-based design. I'm sure Anne-Marie has a lot of suggestions of tools, and there's lots of great tools that you can use depending on how deep you want to go.
Thanks, James. We're going to come to some of the methods for sure. That's pretty much the next question. But I wanted to add a little bit here, because a couple of things I think are really important to draw out from what you've all been saying, but really useful to maybe bring this into the realm of permaculture, which we have been, but to really locate it in that. And I think the first thing was to say, like, our theory of change, in a way, that is a design for our impact, isn't it? We are designing our impact. That's what we're doing. So it's a design process. We're starting off with what difference do we want to make? What's the lasting impact, the lasting change, significant benefits with the land and people that we're working with? And that relates very strongly to our kind of design goals and design outcomes and what we're aiming for the system. And then we're working backwards from that to the point where we've got a kind of coherent, logical plan. So I think just really positioning the theory of change as a design project is really important, because that then relates to our language and to our sort of mentality about how we do these things. And if we could popularize the theory of change as a design tool to design our impact, then maybe that would help it become more widespread in permaculture networks. And then I think really relating to what you said, James, about the baseline, I think that's really key. I remember I was, talking to Marina before they took on the Apricot Centre in Devon, and she was saying, any advice or anything you'd really like to see? And I said, well, the thing I'd really like you to do more than anything else is make sure you do a really thorough baseline. So soil, water, biodiversity, economic, social, just really try and get your baseline, which I'm sure she would have done anyway. And I'm sure that was part of her plan, but that was one of the things I remember in the discussion. And I remember also Chris Dixon from Tir Benros Isaf in Wales, he'd take a photograph from the same spot 4 times a year, and you could just see the regeneration happening. So he had that, another sort of baseline. But with the Apricot Centre, 5 years later, they were able to go back and remeasure everything. And the improvement in soil, the improvement in water holding capacity, the improvement in worm count, the improvement in every regard just meant that they could demonstrate their impact. And I think it's made such a big difference for them to be able to publish those reports and just show that permaculture, agroforestry, biodynamics combined can have these kind of results. So, they're going from strength to strength. And I do think that baseline survey was important, but in a way, that's the survey stage of a design, isn't it? That's all we're actually doing, is just saying, do the survey well, and then you can go back and test how you've moved from that point. So, yeah, I think those points about the theory of change are brilliant, Samuel, and the baseline, and all that you've said it really does fit with our process, doesn't it? So, if we've got the theory of change as a design framework, what are some of the tools and techniques then that we might use? I mean, I've never heard of an outcome star. So could you kind of, between the three of you, give us some of your top tips in terms of some of the ways that you, some of the methods that you use to evaluate your work? Samuel, maybe you could start by just telling me what an outcome star is.
So an outcome star is essentially, it's like a wheel. So you've got like, you've probably seen it in different other mentality methods. So you rate everything from 1 to 10, and you've basically got a circle of, say, 10 different things, and then what you end up with is a web, a circle that might be or spokes that are looking at different levels. And what that enables us to do, it gives you different things. So it enables the person themselves to see those patterns. So you can look about from the beginning to the middle, and you can look at it and go, well, what's the difference? What's changed? And why is that? Why haven't I done? Because sometimes what we say is that in the middle, you might see somebody actually mark themselves down on something, and then go back up, because sometimes you make progress and then you might dip, and then you'll see the improvement, or you might see that something is a particular struggle area, and that allows you to look at that greater pattern and then focus down on those details. So you've got the wider pattern of what your life is looking like, and I'll use the permaculture from the principle, design from patterns to details. Yeah, you can see that, and that's the same in our project. We use that for looking at how people are progressing, how the groups are progressing, and also we're looking at, well, attendance. And one of the things that we think of is we don't criticize people if they're late. So if they're late, they're late. And over time, you see some people who were always late, that pattern starts to change. And you think, well, why is that? And the reason is because they're somebody who's always been late. They've always received criticism, so that pattern keeps reoccurring. But when they're in an environment where they're accepted and it's okay, and they're allowed to be themselves, then they have the space to change. So that's one of the fundamental things, is looking at things in different ways. So we use the outcome star. We use the group evaluation where people are being observed, and people know that they're being observed. So now we've taken that, and we give people little cards to say, oh, this is what we've noted. Yeah, well done. We've seen this change. We've seen this, and then that's almost like oh, thank you. We're pretty, I would say, easily using probably about 10 different evaluation models in our project. So you've got group evaluation, personal evaluation, interaction, communication, and these all build up to that picture for them, for us, and for the people who are referring them to us, to social prescribers, and then for the funders, because we can go back and go, these are the changes. We can look back on our project and go, look, over time, we can see the attendance has shifted from when we started it to it was quite low, and then it got better, it's got better, it's got better, it's got better.
Great. Thanks, Samuel. Thank you. Anne-Marie, do you want to give us some of your evaluation methods that you...
Yeah. Well, I like to use and value diversity in methods. Yes, I think what Samuel was talking about, I've heard called a spider diagram. It sounds the same sort of idea,
Yes.
which is useful for something like permaculture, because you're looking from patterns to details. Of course, you want to look at the whole pattern of how the project works, and making sure you include something around the 3 different ethics. So I've actually talking about the ethics. I think it's super useful for evaluations. We want to be looking at people care and earth care and fair shares. Those are our core ethics. And to do a broad permaculture evaluation, it's nice to check in with all those different ethics for a start. Yeah. I do mostly qualitative these days, and one of the qualitative things is to triangulate. So you want to have multiple sources of information, talking to people, talking to different types of stakeholders, asking them similar questions to the beneficiaries. Observation, if people say that they've introduced gardens, it'd be nice to see them in action. That tends to be what I do. Quantitative I've done as well, but that's been more for the more expensive big monitoring evaluations. USAID ask you to collect so much data, and it can go a bit over the top. And I think with permaculture projects, you want to keep it simple and don't collect more data than you're going to analyze. Produce no waste. It's just wasteful if you collect data that you don't use, or you haven't decided what its use is going to be. And I've seen projects, these big projects, they literally only analyze 50% of their data they collect. And we don't want to be doing that. So keep it simple, straightforward. Just do as much as is needed to be able to answer the questions that you're posing. Okay, and as for tool, are we talking about tools yet?
Yeah, the sort of methods that we're approaching.
Yes, I don't tend to use a lot of fancy tools. I use the ones that are free and easy, like Google Forms, Google Sheets, Excel.
Yeah.
Straightforward stuff that most people have on their computers.
Great, thanks, Anne-Marie. Well, I think we'll come back to maybe something about kind of good questions in a question or two. James, any tools or methods that you particularly like to use?
Yeah, I feel like what Anne-Marie was saying, what you were saying, Anne-Marie, about just collect what you need, I feel is important. So thinking about what are those questions that help meet your vision. So is that going to evidence the change that you want to create? Yes, then measure it. If you're going to use it, that's great. But also, Samuel, earlier you spoke about a common language, which I think is very important, because often if we're trying to make a point with our impact measurement, if we're trying to influence those change makers and those policy makers and the ones who we want to influence, sometimes using the language that they use is very important. And there might be specific metrics that they measure that we can say then, oh, well, look, a conventional approach to feeding people will do this, but actually if you do permaculture, it's this. And you can make that direct comparison because you're using the same language and the same metrics. So there is value in that if you can. But I also just want to touch on, I think, Samuel, this story that you told earlier about someone showing up late earlier on in the program, and then further on they were late less of the time, I think is a really nice story, because and a really nice point, because often when we're thinking about impact measurement, there's not really one thing that will tell you that your impact has happened, right? There's not usually one thing that you can measure to prove this impact, because impact is often complex and large and big and multifaceted. So you have to kind of choose questions and choose things to measure that will almost be a lighthouse showing you that this impact has happened. It's almost like saying that if this happens, then yes, it's showing you that the impact is happening. And like Andy, before you spoke about like a worm count in the soil. If you do a baseline survey of the worms before, and then how many worms per square meter before and after, then you can show that you probably have more worms in the soil after you've implemented your permaculture design a few years on. But alone, that isn't really telling you much, but it's pointing towards the direction that soil health is improved, that, soil water retention has improved, so it's not necessarily alone telling you anything other than you have more worms in your soil, which is great, but it's pointing towards the larger impact of better soil health, better biodiversity, etc. So it's kind of choosing those metrics and those things you want to measure that will point towards the impact that you want to evidence, basically. So what are you wanting to evidence? What will show you that is happening? So I guess picking a bit of a mixture of questions between maybe some that are kind of more conventional metrics, so you can make those comparisons with more conventional approaches and maybe conventional funders even, and maybe then thinking what's unique to your project that will point towards the impact that you want to show. And
thanks, James, that's great. That to me, maybe one of the things that we haven't mentioned there yet is kind of indicators. And I'd written down something just before you mentioned that, which was about how do we make sure that we're getting results that other people can relate to. So, if we're trying to have an influence in policy, then we need to make sure that we're getting results that can then relate to the policy that we're trying to change. So, if there's a particular way of measuring nutrition, if you measure it in a different way and people say, well, I still don't know if that relates to what we're trying to achieve. So making our results relatable is important. But the indicators is great. It reminds me of one of our members, a guy called Professor Steve Newman, who has done a lot of work on agroforestry, and they did a big poverty project or a poverty alleviation project in Mexico, and they talked to local people, and what they realized was that the best indicator that they could have for success was how many children were wearing shoes to school. Because once people had enough money to meet their needs, the first thing that they would go out and do is make sure their kids could walk to school with shoes on. And so they decided that was going to be their indicator. And the great thing was that everybody in the area could also measure that on a very relatable way. And I think that there's something there which is really lovely about the meaningful results, indicators that tell us whether we're on the path to success. So yeah, I mean, I guess that leads to a question, which is, do you have any tips about how you can design monitoring and evaluation in a way that helps you to kind of track your impact over the, over the short or long term, maybe the medium or long term, So how do you design monitoring and evaluation so you can track it? Not necessarily easily, but more easily. I'd really like to come in on that.
Well, with a people-based project, what we've found is it's really important also to engage the people who are looking to help.
Yeah.
And that, so when we think about a theory of change, that's something that we've taken into, so we have like an onboarding process, and then in that we ask people, well, what are your goals and objectives? And the language is slightly different to that, because some people that's quite scary, as some people won't actually put anything. But then it's like you will also get them to do a brief, like, kind of tick thing of like, what would you like to try something new? Would you like to have a new hobby? So you're giving them something that they can go, oh yes, I'd like to do that. And engagement with people is really important, because what we're trying to do is give people meaning that's important to them. Not what's, yes, we've got our own assessments, we've got things, but if we're not engaging them with the process and giving them something that has power for them, and why are we doing it? I hope that makes sense. So that was fundamental, and we do that throughout our program. The way that when we're looking at the impact of transforming the projects, we're doing designs and we're engaging them in every area, so they're being included with the designs, and that's part of the way that we can gauge how they're improving as well, because we can look at how they're interacting in that group. So looking at different ways that you can engage people in an easy way, that enables people to take ownership of the process and also feed back into it. So you're looking at using things that you might not think about generally, using their experience and their points of view to improve your process all the time.
Great. So really building participants' own lived experience and their own sense of what would be meaningful as part of the evaluation and monitoring.
Yeah, and it does. I think it's a later question, but it goes back into how is the community informing what you're doing, which is what funders ask. How is your project changing because of the work that you're doing? How are the community involved with your project? So that's down to your evaluation as well. It's looking at that changes and looking for things and going, well, where are the gaps? Because we are showing what's going wrong in our evaluation reports. We said, oh, we've noticed this, so we're now doing this instead.
Yeah.
Because we've thought, well, that's not quite working. We're not getting engagement in that way. So what can we do differently?
Great. Thanks, Samuel. Anne-Marie, you coming in now?
Just a quick point, really. I mean, you mentioned taking a series of photos every year or twice a year, whatever. And you can set up a little cohort of respondents and go back to the same ones a couple of times a year. I've done that with Save the Children. They set up a cohort, and several families were responding to questions about their diet and what they were growing, etc. And it was quite useful to see the trend over a few years of a project. And you could add, as Samuel was describing, questions that are particularly have come out of a previous participatory process that are very meaningful, and follow them over time.
Yeah. Thank you. James?
I'm hearing, yeah, this is really interesting. I'm hearing almost some principles emerging of like how we design M&E and impact assessment that is, and I'm hearing meaningful come up quite a lot. Like, is it meaningful to the people, the community that is participating in this, and or is it meaningful to the land and the place where this is? Also, is it easeful? Like, is it easy? You were saying before, Anne-Marie, which I think is really good, because if it's not easy to measure, it will be a bit more difficult. And I think also the example you brought up, Andy, of the children wearing shoes is quite easy to measure because it's something very visible and you can see. And also, maybe, is it useful? Like, does it have use beyond just the measurements? Or can it be used to influence policymakers? Can it be used to grow the movement? Yeah, I don't know if others hear more, but I feel like these three really are sitting very well with me.
Yeah. Thanks, James. I mean, I want all three of you on my kind of master group to help evaluate permaculture in Britain, because that, I think, is a very significant project that needs to be done. Okay, so we've got like 15 minutes left. I've still got a bunch of questions. I'm trying to work out what we focus on. I wonder, the kind of surveys and questionnaires come out a lot. That seems to be a kind of go-to activity that a lot of people engage in. So I think it would be useful to touch a little bit on surveys and questionnaires. So any kind of top tips or observations on how to make a survey work really well, which I would say, includes actually getting people to fill it in. So yeah, any thoughts on that? Surveys and questionnaires.
It's more time consuming, but what we've noticed works best in the past is having a conversation with people. It's and obviously you can't always do that, especially if it's thousands of participants. But yeah, people just don't fill in surveys, right? It can be really hard to get responses. And I think having a conversation with people, or making it, at least personalizing it in some way, is really helpful. And that can just be a simple, like, there's some great tools that you can download for your email client, so you can personalize emails very easily. And just personalizing the emails makes it one step more accessible for people, I think, because they see their name, they're right, oh, this is for me, I'll fill this in. So I feel like scales of personalizing it, whether it's just personalizing the email that you're sending out to people, or having a call with someone and actually getting that information more conversationally. We found that works a bit better.
Great. Thank you, James. Anne-Marie?
Yes, I think I mentioned a few things already, but something very very obvious is that making sure that the person knows about the topic you're asking them about. I've seen that mistake made, and you've got lots of different stakeholders. Well, I suppose in my work there's national, local, village level, and getting the language right for the person. Don't go all technical for people who are not familiar with that, because you'll lose them right at the beginning. Don't ask them for masses of details that you don't really need and they're struggling to remember. You know, that's a bit stressful for people if you ask them things that are quite difficult to answer. So what I find usually is, as James was saying, a conversational style and starting off open-ended. I mean, you need to have at least something open-ended to capture unexpected positives and negatives. You always need to make sure you include that. And I find if you're talking to people about things that affect their lives, usually they don't find it, this is face-to-face, obviously, they don't find it too onerous. You know, it's something quite satisfying for people to tell you what's worked and what wasn't, and particularly to give their suggestions going forward. So I think treating your respondents with respect and listening to them, and you know, listening to their ideas, and then ideally feeding back to them what you found.
Yeah, that's really key, isn't it? It's actually, closing the loop, saying thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. Samuel, do you have anything in particular here? Because I've realised the last question is a great one.
No.
You okay for me to move on to the last question?
Yes.
I think looking at the time, this will be our last question, and I realised we should have got to this sooner. So here we go. What are the opportunities and challenges? What opportunities and challenges are there in assessing the impact of permaculture projects? Because I think it's hard. So, Anne-Marie, you have measured the impact of some permaculture projects. So, what opportunities or challenges did you find? And then let's make sure we hear from James and Samuel too.
Yes, it is permaculture projects do present a challenge to sort of regular monitoring and evaluation methods, I think, just in the very nature of the, you know, multiple functions for each element, multiple elements for each function. If you try and draw that into a theory of change, before you know it, it's a sort of spaghetti junction diagram, and you know, you're trying to tease out what are the main points. So I think it is a complex exercise if you want to go into that level of detail. But I think on the other hand, with permaculture projects, because there is that level of complexity and really looking at so many different things, that your impact can be more likely to be achieved. So what I think for me is you've got to be a bit focused. You can't look at everything. But if you can be quite focused and look at a particular aspect of what you're doing, that can be quite good. But having said that, it's also good to look at the different ethics of permaculture, because I'm thinking of agroecological farming methods. If you measure using a conventional sort of what's the yield, which most agriculture projects are doing that. They're just measuring the yield of the main crop. Then agroecological permaculture projects won't do terribly well necessarily just measuring the outcome as the yield of one thing. But if you bring in the soil and the health of the people and what's the environment doing and all the different parameters, then they measure really well. So that's kind of our challenge and our opportunity. Yeah, is that the impact is likely to be there, but it is also complex. And there are some interesting tools, like revaluation is a handy method, which we're trying to get to grips with. to look at the more holistic outcomes. But yeah, it is a challenge.
Okay, thanks, Anne-Marie. James, you look poised.
Well, Anne-Marie was just talking about tools that are interesting, and I think another one that I wanted to mention is called also agroecological focus, but I guess like an aligned movement to permaculture, but called TAPE. I wonder if you've heard of it, Anne-Marie. Yeah, it's interesting because it kind of deals with a bit of the complexity of agroecological and permaculture systems in an interesting way, and kind of guides people through it in using this tool. But it is really challenging to kind of conceptualize all that complexity into just simple indicators and metrics. So acknowledging that challenge, I think, is the first step. And also earlier you said, Anne-Marie, that you don't have to measure everything. I mean, pick a few things. And I think that's a really nice point as well, too. And I think at least if you're looking at some metrics and measuring some things within the ethics of earth care, people care, and fair share, that's a good start. You know, what can show that you're having impact, you know, ecologically? What can show that you're having impact in a human community? What can show that you're distributing resource? You know, starting there could help, you know, distill some of that richness and complexity. So that could be a good start.
Yeah, great. Thanks. And I saw you put the link in the chat for that tool. Thank you, James. And Samuel, any opportunities and challenges that you've noticed in assessing the impact of permaculture projects?
Well, with us, it's always, how do you assess an intangible result? You know, how do you, and that's what we're working on, you know, with people's well-being. It's not always a defined thing in everything, but then it's bringing it down. So we're looking at the occupational therapy model, how we can use occupational therapy in the community and use that to demonstrate actually how permaculture actually aligns with that very well. And so we're looking at what other things. I suppose it's using that standard model that's been used in medical care, and then saying, well, we're delivering this and through the permaculture principles, and how does that align? So that's how we're looking at things. And I noticed that James put up about the Lush Spring Prize. Another method of evaluating your project is, you know, we were asked to do an external validation for our first year, and one way of externally validating your project is applying for an award or prize, because that makes you think about things maybe that you haven't done before. So getting external eyes to look at that's why we focus so much on doing different awards. So we look at, so in the local food and drink awards, which last year we won gold in 2 categories, they look at all these things. So they look at, well, where are you socially? What impact are you socially? What impacts are you sustainable? What are you doing? So that's all around making a food product. So we're looking at our packaging, we're looking at our labeling, we're looking at our ingredients. Are they local? What kind of things are we buying? Where are we buying it from, our supply chain? And that comes, I believe, into the wider area of projects, of how you impact it, because then somebody's going and said, well, they're doing a good job.
Yeah.
And that's another way of showing your impact and getting rewarded for it in a different way.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Samuel. Okay, well, I feel like we've had a really rich conversation, and I've certainly come away with some new tools and some new thinking. And yeah, I mean, I would like to really encourage all of us to be focusing more on celebrating our impact, because I think the one word that we haven't really talked about was actually in the title of the session, which is celebrating impact. And I think that there's a lot to celebrate in permaculture, and there's massive challenges out in the world. And actually, one of the things that we talked about earlier was this whole idea of motivation and keeping motivation going in a project. And I think if we had a greater sense of the impact of our work, both individually, collectively, as part of the association, as part of local projects, the more we could share that, the more maybe we'll feel motivated to continue and to grow what we do. So I think it's a really, really important and valuable area. And now we've reached that kind of 40-year milestone. I think there's a lot of harvesting to be done, a lot of sharing of the impacts that we've had. So yeah, really, really valuable conversation. Thank you so much to Anne-Marie, James, and Samuel. And I'm going to pass on to Hannah, who's going to finish our session.
Thank you, panel, for all the knowledge and insights you shared, and thank you, Andy, for facilitating. I just wanted to share a couple of bits about some events we've got coming up before we say goodbye. So we've got the next in our series of masterclasses. We've got a little bit of a break over August for the summer, but we have our next masterclass on the 25th of September. And that's about mainstreaming permaculture. So it's going to be a really great session looking at how we can really integrate permaculture into different areas of life. So whether that be education, business, and so on. We've got a great panel of speakers. We've got Christabel from Earth Ed, which is a nature skills platform. We've got Bob Mehew from the Apricot Centre, which Andy mentioned earlier, a biodynamic farm in Devon, and Paula Moses, who is a primary school teacher and ex-head teacher and a former head teacher, and is doing loads of work to integrate permaculture into the curriculum. So yeah, really great panel, diverse panel there. And I also just wanted to let you all know about some of our campfire events we've got coming up as well. So again, we've got a little bit of break over August because obviously people are possibly on holidays and stuff. But starting from September, we've got a series of 3 campfire events, which are all online again. And it's actually a series of campfires looking at seeds. So you can come to one or you can come to all 3 if you're interested. But we'll take like a local view on seed sovereignty and resilience. And then we've got a session on perennial seed as well is the next one with Martin Crawford. And also a session with the Gaia Foundation that's looking more nationally at the politics of seed. So hopefully that's something that people here might be interested in. I will send a follow-up email after this because I know I've just kind of thrown that out there at the end of a really rich session. So I'll send all the details through and a copy of the recording. And also I'll add the link to the spring prize as well, and any other information that the panel want me to share. And just while we're on the topic of monitoring and evaluation, we do monitoring and evaluation on these sessions. So I'm having the conversation now, and I'm hoping that when I send the survey around after the session, you'll give us some feedback on how we might be able to improve these sessions going forwards, and if there's any other topics you'd like to see to inform our upcoming programme. So yeah, I think that's pretty much it. We didn't have any questions, so I'm hoping that like all of your questions were answered with the depth of the session. It was really great. And yeah, have a lovely evening and hopefully see you at future sessions.
Thank you, Hannah.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. Thanks, Samuel. Thanks all for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Great
Bye.
to see you all.
Yeah, and you.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay, see you.